Sighing at the memory, Jessica took the plate and glass to the table and sat down to eat. Chewing slowly, Jessica contemplated how she had gotten to this state. Was she going to leave Malcolm one day? Had that been the case all along? She wasn't sure. She had been very happy with Malcolm for most of their life together. And it wasn't that Malcolm had done anything wrong to her. Even though she knew what she had done was cheating, and more, at the time she had started dating Ian, she had felt guilty that he had almost died at the hands of her husband. Ian had repeatedly pointed out that the whole thing was unfair. Malcolm was protected from the law thanks to the influence of her parents and their friends, so he would never have to pay for his crime. Jessica had disagreed at first because she knew that what she had almost done was considered unforgivable, and that Ian was just as much to blame as she was. In essence, although Malcolm took his anger to the extreme, he was only protecting what he held sacred to himself and her family. However, over time, after constant attacks on Jessica's beliefs, Ian slowly but surely began to change her mind until she gave in and continued what Ian had so rudely interrupted that day in the woods. She never wanted to have other people's children, but despite all the precautions with birth control, she ended up getting Ian pregnant. Ian was quick to point out that even with the best birth control, the fact that she got pregnant by him meant that they were destined to be together. Although Ian's explanation seemed somewhat far-fetched, she agreed with it, if only to assuage her mind from the guilt that sometimes almost overwhelmed her. We had never discussed the possibility of her leaving Malcolm until one day, just a couple of years ago, when Ian had asked if she was interested in making their relationship more permanent and legal. Since then, Ian had pestered her almost every time they met with questions about when she was going to leave Malcolm. At first, she had been surprised and somewhat shocked by Ian's insistence, but as time went on, the idea seemed less and less real to her. Then, more recently, Ian had demanded that she never do it with Malcolm again, as his jealousy had become too strong to allow such thoughts of her and Malcolm. Once again, Jessica obediently complied with the order. Everything was going just as Ian had said it would. Part of the plan was to keep their affair a secret until Jessica left Malcolm and divorced him, and then publicly announced their marriage. Then Claire came to town. Now that the cat was out of the bag, the announcement was a moot point. However, something was bothering her. Upon reflection, Jessica realized that Ian hadn't made himself known while Claire was in town. When Jessica had asked him about it, he had brushed it off without giving her any real answer. Later, a few days after Claire had left, Ian explained that he had lurked because Jessica's sister's presence brought back bad memories. Jessica thought that was a little odd, since Claire and his friend were the ones who had saved Ian's life. She thought Ian would have greeted Claire with a wide smile and open arms. Though at some moments, like now, when this next oddity occurred, Jessica felt a nascent doubt, her suspicions growing, fueled by all the questions she'd asked Ian over the years that still remained unanswered. The ringing of the phone interrupted her musings. It was Ian. "Hi, Ian. I was just thinking about you," Jessica greeted coldly. "Oh? Is that bad?" Ian asked, chuckling slightly. Ignoring the question, Jessica asked, "How was your day?" "Wonderful. How was yours?" Ian replied. "I've had better," Jessica said, trying to suppress a yawn, but she failed. "You look upset. Are you okay? Did Malcolm do something?" Ian asked, feigning concern. "No, I'm just tired." "Good, sweetheart. I won't keep you long. I called to ask if you and the kids would come over to my place tomorrow. It's Saturday and—" Pausing, as if carefully considering his next words, Ian began again. "Since he knows about us, I think it's time we stopped hiding in the shadows. I can thank Claire for that. I say that sincerely. She did me a favor for both of us. What do you say? Do we agree tomorrow?" He had to act calm and not push too hard, because he knew that ever since her damn sister had come to town, Jessica had been growing more and more distant from him and could easily leave him. There was silence for a few seconds. Then, "I don't know, Ian. I still think we should wait a little longer. Maybe until the divorce is final." Surprised by her hesitant and lethargic response, since Ian thought she would be swayed by his news, he replied, "It could be up to a year before that happens. And what are we supposed to do? Ignore each other until then?" "I don't know, Ian. I used to know what I was doing. Now I'm not sure." "What does that mean?" Ian asked, somewhat angry at her reluctance, but curious despite his emotional detachment from the woman. Sighing sadly, Jessica replied quietly, "Nothing. It doesn't matter. I made my own bed. Now I have to lie in it. So it doesn't matter." With an effort to push the regrets away, Jessica asked, "What about this Saturday?" Mentally shrugging off Jessica's lethargic behavior, Ian thought, "I'll soon be rid of this annoying slut. She's getting harder and harder to manipulate and more prone to whimsy. Perhaps I'm losing control of her. No matter, I've almost finished what I started. One more day, and it will be done." "Ah, yes, Saturday. I thought you might come and bring the children with you. We'll announce our marriage ceremony, if not to everyone, at least to them." "What? No. We're not going to say anything about any wedding. We don't need my kids to come because I'm not going to say anything to them. And neither are you." Even more angry over Jessica's outright refusal, Ian replied, "No, you won't. But for one thing, they're mine too." Getting even more upset over her outright refusal, Ian said, unable to contain his anger, "Tell you what, Jessica, either you bring them here and we'll explain the situation together, or I'll contact them directly and explain a few separate things to them. Take your pick." Jessica heard his tone. It was cold and unyielding, and she knew immediately that Ian would do what he said, what he'd promised. She'd encountered Ian's different moods many times over the years they'd been together, but this was a new side of his character that she'd never encountered, at least not fully. Until now. The rapidly escalating tension made dinner threaten to return. "I mean, I have something special planned for you. It's a celebration of, well, us. All of us." Ian continued relentlessly. "But we can do it differently. I can and want to explain to the kids who their real father is. So either we announce our marriage or I'll announce something else. Either way, it will be interesting." Jessica realized she was cornered and saw no way out of the situation. With a sense of dread, she gave up, resigning herself to what awaited her. "Fine, damn you to hell, I'll come." "What about the children?" Ian asked in a voice devoid of compassion. Sighing, Jessica replied, "I'll try to get them to come. They have their own schedule and—" Ian interrupted her and said in a brittle voice, "I don't care how you do it. Just make sure they're here tomorrow, understood?" "Yes," Jessica replied in a soft, defeated tone. "Speak louder, I couldn't hear you," Ian demanded, enunciating in a voice heavy with emotion. "Yes, I said yes." "That's my girl," Ian exclaimed joyfully. You could clearly hear the glee in his tone. "It will all be over soon, my dear Jessica, and each of us will be able to move on with our lives." Like after a bomb falls, Ian thought with a quiet, maniacal laugh. He waited for Jessica's response, knowing she was broken, but nonetheless enjoying her squirming like a worm on a hook. Everything else that would follow would not concern Jessica or her offspring. They were all a means to an end, and that end was obvious. Ian had planned everything meticulously, and Malcolm Harris would pay for his sins to the fullest. Instead of responding to Ian's remark, Jessica calmly disconnected the call. Ian was furious. How dare she hang up the phone? Perhaps her will wasn't as strong as he'd assumed. Never mind, Ian thought. Everyone will pay tomorrow. Next chapter. Jessica felt trapped, in a way she had never felt before. Even though her own actions had led to this, she still held a grudge against Malcolm. It was illogical, but somehow Jessica felt that Malcolm was partly to blame for her situation. If he hadn't tried to destroy Ian, none of this would have happened. She wouldn't have felt an overpowering sense of guilt. Guilt, the path to which eventually led her to Ian's bed. And to an even bigger relationship, which in turn had led her to her current situation. One thing she knew for sure, she wasn't going to involve her children in this. No matter what she told Ian, there was no way she was going to ask her kids to come over tomorrow. This was between her and Ian, and no one else. Well, maybe one other person, but she wasn't about to tell Malcolm who she'd been having fun with all these years. Shuddering at her audacity, she decided she would write something down. Next chapter. Malcolm woke up suddenly. He opened his eyes, trying to focus. Getting out of bed, he checked his alarm clock and looked at the time. It was 6:45 Saturday morning. Mal had planned to sleep in a little later, but something woke him up, and he still couldn't figure out what it could have been. Maybe it was an unusual sound? Maybe there was someone in the house? Some of the children? But he hadn't heard anything unusual since waking up. Shaking his head in bewilderment, he considered going back to sleep, but now he was fully awake, so he could get up and start his day. Having accomplished the 3 S's, Malcolm headed for the kitchen, contemplating what to make for breakfast. First on the list was coffee. Second was what to eat. Cereal? No, the thought of eating something cold upset his stomach. How about an omelet? Yeah, that sounds good. And toast. With copious amounts of butter on each slice. He heard his stomach rumble in agreement. And so, whistling softly but cheerfully, he began to prepare breakfast. He was washing the dishes when the house phone rang. He ignored the call, as it was still pretty early for a Saturday, and he didn't feel like talking to anyone yet. He was just enjoying the morning. A few seconds after the call, the cell phone on the table rang. Irritated by 2 interruptions in a row, Malcolm said, not addressing anyone in particular, "Damn it, can't I have some quiet time?" He ignored the cell phone as well, waiting for its insistent digital ringing to stop. It eventually did, but no sooner had the tune stopped than it rang again. Discarding the pan he'd been cleaning and drying his calloused hands with a sharp, swift motion, Malcolm pulled out his cell phone and looked to see who was calling. It wasn't a name, but an unfamiliar long-distance number. He decided not to answer, but as he took the phone in his hands, he changed his mind. With an angry motion, he took the call. "What? Malcolm, is that you?" The woman's voice sounded familiar, but Malcolm couldn't immediately identify who it was. "Yes, who is it?" The voice sounded panting. "Malcolm, it's Claire. Please don't hang up. Something's happened to Jessica." "Claire? What the hell?" thought Malcolm, mentally digesting her words. "How did you get my phone number?" Malcolm demanded. "Never mind that. Jessica's in some kind of trouble. She texted me," Claire began, speaking quickly. "What makes you think I care about that slut? She's not my problem anymore," Malcolm stated firmly, interrupting his former sister-in-law. "Please, Malcolm, this isn't just about Jessica, it's about your children," Claire pleaded. Worry was quickly replaced by irritation. "What about Trisha and Jackson?" Malcolm exploded, his voice deeper and harder. "I'm not sure. Jessica wrote me a letter, but there's a lot of confusion in it. But she mentioned them several times, and also Ian's name. She's meeting Ian at his house this morning to straighten things out. Ian wanted the kids to attend the meeting. It all sounds ominous." "I can forward the letter and you can read it for yourself," Claire explained hastily. "I'm really concerned, Mel. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered you." Ignoring Claire's explanation, Malcolm asked sharply, "What time did they meet and where?" "At 8 o'clock. I'll send you his address," Claire replied quickly. "I'll send a letter too." "Okay, I'm off," Malcolm muttered, grabbing his coat and car keys. "Thank you, Malcolm. Please hurry up. It's almost 8 o'clock," Claire exclaimed in desperation. "As soon as we hang up, I'll find the flight." Hearing the concern in her voice, Malcolm hesitated, and another question popped into his head. "Why are you really doing this? After all, from what I hear, you hate your sister." There was a long silence at first. Then, almost without hesitation, she said slowly, "Hated. Long ago I hated Jess with an unquenchable passion. That hatred, she was my manna of heaven, but not anymore. I stopped harboring resentment long ago." Suppressing a quiet laugh, she said, "Don't you know that hate is bad for the soul? And whatever she has done, she is my sister. We're not close, but she's still my sister. Blood thicker and all that." Grumbling in acknowledgement of his wife's sister's words, Malcolm hung up the phone. A few seconds later, an address came to his phone. Focusing on getting there safely, Malcolm raced down the city streets, grateful for the light morning traffic. Next chapter. Jessica arrived at Ian's semi-luxury apartment just after 8 in the morning. She was alone. Whatever was on Ian's mind, he didn't need kids who would undoubtedly make some ridiculous oratory-like speeches. Here came Ian's door. Simple in its splendor, just like Ian had once been, Jessica thought. Not taking a deep breath, she brought her hand to the buzzer. Jessica didn't press the button right away, however, as if something held her finger hovering just above the buzzer button. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you ready for the confrontation that will inevitably arise since you don't have children? Jessica asked herself. She realized there was more to it than that, making her question her resolve, but she wasn't ready to delve into that right now. Shaking her head and mistaking her doubts for simple discomfort, she pressed the call button. She was surprised when the door opened a few seconds later, as it usually took Ian much longer to get to the door, depending on where he was at that moment. She was even more surprised, shocked even, when she realized who had opened the door. Her son, Jackson, was standing on the threshold with a slightly perplexed expression on his face, waiting for her to enter. "Come on, Mom. Come in already," Jackson said with some irritation. "What? How?" Jessica began, but couldn't focus her thoughts to formulate the question she wanted to ask. Jackson gently took her hand and gently guided her inside. The movement helped him break the mental grip that was restraining her. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" Shrugging, Jackson replied, "Mr. Wilson called last night and asked to meet him and you here, that you had something to tell us." Ian. He ran around her. He knew she wasn't going to let the kids in. "Us?" Looking at her son up close, Jessica suddenly realized that he looked something like Mel. Of course, she realized it was impossible, just her mind playing tricks on her. Wish fulfillment, perhaps? Who else is here? You and... Almost afraid to ask the question, she was even more afraid of the answer. Putting her hands up and pointing with both palms facing herself, Jackson said, "Just me. Trish had something else to do, and Mr. Wilson is here, of course." Nodding her head, Jessica peeked behind the foyer wall and, making sure everything was clear, turned to her son and said in an insistent whisper, "Go away, Jackson." Seeing the look of stubbornness that was beginning to show on his face, Jessica only despaired even more. "Don't argue. Please, Jackson, just leave. Right now." Confused by his mother's unusual behavior, her son stared into her face. "What's going on, Mom? Why are you whispering?" Before she could answer, a voice burst into the room. "Ah, there you are, Jess. I'm glad you came, although I'm a little disappointed that Trisha couldn't make it. But that's the way cookies are sometimes put together." "Huh?" Grinning at his own misplaced humor, Ian Wilson turned around and limped back into the main room. "Come in. Come on in. Everyone have a seat. Refreshments on the serving cart. Help yourselves. There's no ceremony in my house. Mi casa es tu casa." Jackson moved away from his mom and headed over to the cart to see if there was anything he liked. "Jackson," Jessica called out to him. "Go home." Ian quickly intervened. "What's the matter, Jess? Don't you want him to know the truth?" Jackson stopped and turned to his mother, hearing how briefly she called his name. He then looked puzzled at Ian Wilson as he asked his questions. Turning back to his mother, Jackson asked with a confused look, "What are you talking about? Going home? What's the truth?" Before Jessica could answer, Ian said with brittle glee, "My dear boy, your mom wanted you to leave and come home because she didn't want you to know who your real father was." "Huh?" Frowning, Jackson looked at Ian, then at his mother. "What's he talking about, Mom?" "Go home, Jackson. We'll talk about this later." Seeing his reluctance, Jessica added, "I promise I'll explain everything, but not right now. Go home and I'll meet you there in a little while." "No," Wilson shouted. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "He's staying here. Jackson is old enough to know how things are on this earth." Already calmer, but with an evil bitterness, he made no attempt to hide, he finished, "and he'll learn the awful truth about his mom." Surprised by Ian's emotional outburst, Jessica was caught off guard by the sudden change in behavior. Shocked, she was unable to respond. Jackson, on the other hand, quickly realized what was at stake and was not easily broken by Ian's anger. "Hey, don't talk to my mom like that," Jackson said in a firm and confident voice. His handsome face was stern and serious, and his brown eyes were cold with unspoken determination. "Huh? How am I supposed to talk to your mother, Jackson? For that matter, why should I even talk to her if what I have to tell you, though related to her, is no longer a part of her? At best, your mother was a breeding machine. At worst, she's no better than a whore. But maybe I'm being too hard on whores. At least they're honest about what they are." Jessica gasped upon hearing Ian's hurtful statement. A slut? She wasn't a slut. Why had he said that? Ian loved her. He had confessed his love to her many times over the years. And she loved Ian. Didn't she? Didn't she? Immersed in her thoughts, Jessica didn't notice her son moving toward Ian, nor did she pay attention to Jackson's low growl as he began to hurry away. Stop, boy, Ian shouted, quickly stepping back and tucking his right hand behind his back to reach for his revolver. Stop! Ian, what are you doing? He's our son! Jessica screamed, noticing Ian's hateful words and the gun he was holding on Jackson. He's not my son. I don't have a son. He has my genetic material, but nothing more than that. So don't play this shit with me. Jackson stopped when he saw the gun pointed at him. But instead of being scared, he felt his anger growing, especially when Wilson called his mom a whore. But, you said, Jessica began, trying to make sense of what was happening. Jackson turned to face his mom, keeping Ian within his peripheral vision and using his body as a shield, but at the same time blindly fumbling for something on his belt. Jackson hoped his actions went unnoticed by the man holding the gun. Forget what I said, you stupid whore. I just used you. Yes, that's right. Used you. To get back at your bitch husband. I played you like a fiddle from the very first time. Ian laughed madly. How could I love a woman who broke her word and gave up on everyone else? You were so easy. I thought I'd have to work hard for it. But no, you gave up after a few weeks. What, you've been toying with me? All these years? Jessica asked in surprise, stunned by such a revelation. Yes, I've been playing, Ian laughed. If Malcolm had just accepted it like a man and let me entertain you all those years ago, it would have been over back then. But he had to play the pissed-off hero. Ian seemed to lose his temper and started shouting profanities at Jessica. You goddamn whore! Unfaithful whore! You never loved me? Jessica asked in a trembling voice. Wow, you've got one hell of a thick skull. Weren't you listening? Ian scoffed. Of course I never loved you. You were a means to an end. A tool. How could I love a tool? The fact is, I hate you. His last statement was met with silence. Jessica was horrified at his words. She was even horrified at her actions with Ian over the years. She had borne him children at his insistence because she thought and believed he loved her. But none of that compared to the swelling feelings of hopelessness and sadness when she realized how deeply she had betrayed her husband, all in vain. Nothing but a twisted sense of revenge for what had happened so long ago. Grief-stricken, she let out a sorrowful cry for all that might have been, but now would never be. Yes, now you know how I felt all those agonizingly despicable years ago, Ian said bleakly. I had planned to tell you all how I used you, Jessica, how you robbed Malcolm of his offspring, about how you will all know for the rest of your lives what a bitch and a whore you are. Ian laughed quietly but gloatingly as he waved the gun haphazardly, paying no attention to anyone. I want the whole world to know how much your vows mean to you, that you, a married woman, are willing to go to bed with any man and bear him children. Spurred on by his own venomous outpourings, Ian continued his rancid speech more animatedly. More importantly, I want to see the look on that bastard's face when he finds out the whole truth, to see the hopelessness of his failures. I want to see him blazing with rage at his helplessness. Ian's ringing laughter echoed eerily throughout the large apartment. Then Jessica noticed in passing that most of the furniture was missing. She glanced into the bedroom and saw that it lacked her usual furnishings. Ah, you noticed the lack of furniture. How perceptive of you, slut, Ian exclaimed mockingly. I gave the furniture to charity. I'm sure they could use it. My business here is done, so I'm moving on. You despicable little man. Jessica finally found her voice and started up, her fear of Ian and his gun taking a back seat to her growing anger. For your information, I tampered with all the organs, since I couldn't tell if you were there or not. Ian, surprised by Jessica's verbal attack, froze in bewilderment for a moment, but quickly pulled himself together. Why, you bitch? Shouted Ian, but before he could finish the sentence, Jackson suddenly lunged forward with a blood-chilling scream. Lunging, the young man caught up with Ian at the very moment Ian raised his hand and fired. The sharp shot echoed off the walls of the nearly empty apartment. The gunman and the young man fell together, and Jackson, having gotten the momentum, slammed into Ian. Following the shot, even as the sound of the gunshot still reverberated in the air, a piercing scream rang out. Jessica froze in place, expressing her horror and fear. During her conversation with Ian, she had forgotten about her son's presence. Jackson heard every word she and Ian said. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Jessica felt a slight annoyance, but anxiety for her son drowned out the feeling as her feet moved forward on their own. "Jackson! Jackson!" screamed Jessica, running up to her son. Jackson was lying with his back to Jessica, his face turned away. She wanted to turn Jackson over but wasn't sure if she should. She couldn't remember if this applied to all injuries or just a specific one. Her mind wouldn't give her an answer, so, praying she was doing the right thing, she rolled her son over onto his back. She searched her memory but couldn't remember exactly what slow bleeding meant. So she took her son by one of his arms and felt for a pulse. Yes, there it was, weak but steady. With some relief, Jessica reached for her cell phone to call 911, but a cruel voice stopped her. "Don't even think about it," Ian said hoarsely. Jessica turned to look at Ian and saw that he was holding a gun pointed directly at her. He was still on the floor, but raised his hand to point the gun. "Shit, he might shoot." "Let me call 911, Jackson is badly hurt," yelled Jessica in impotent rage. "No, bitch, you're not calling anyone," groaned Ian, rising to a sitting position and continuing to keep his target in his sights. "What? You're out of your mind. I'm calling 911, Jessica stated firmly. "The law will catch you and burn you for our deaths, you bastard," Jessica said in a voice devoid of any emotion. Slowly rising to his feet, Ian merrily mouthed, "I don't think so. Anyway, just so you know, I wasn't planning on killing anyone. I wanted to let you live out the rest of your miserable lives with the abiding knowledge that you destroyed your husband. Your children will know that their mother is a whore and that they are bastards. And Malcolm, well, Malcolm will know too, but he'll also know that a whole life was wasted. His life. Do you think he'll want to start a new family? Have children with another woman? Will he even trust another woman? That's if he found a woman who wanted to marry him and who was young enough and willing to have children with an old man." Ian Wilson's cold laughter filled the nearly empty apartment. Ian Wilson's cold laughter echoed through the empty rooms. "How could you be so mean? So heartless? I thought you were—" Jessica exclaimed in dismay. "Screw you, bitch!" shouted Ian, his words raining down on Jessica like the beats of a drum. "I didn't force you to do anything. You did everything very willingly. You misled me. You lied. You deceived me with your delusions." "I believed your lies," Jessica said calmly. She didn't feel anything anymore. Her only thought was to buy as much time as possible. Someone had to hear the gunshot and call the police. All that was left to do was wait and help would come to save Jackson. "It's all part of my plan," Ian explained more calmly, taking an example from the nonchalant Jessica. "At least until a few minutes ago. I really didn't intend to kill any of you, not even Malcolm. But when the opportunity presented itself, plans changed," Ian said, smugly pleased with himself. "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, despite her curiosity. "I don't understand. If you weren't going to kill us, why the change of plans?" "Oh, that. Simply put, when the hero is here." Ian shoved Jackson with his foot, attacked me, and I shot him. It occurred to me. I stage a break-in. You and your son broke into my apartment. We got into a fight. I managed to get a gun because I feared for my life. Genius, isn't it? Eyes widening with shock, Jessica couldn't believe her ears. The idea didn't fit in her imagination. She knew it happened all over the place if the news was to be believed, but to hear of such an act, to hear it talked about so casually and deliberately, was beyond horrifying. It boggled the mind. "What?" began Jessica, but something stuck in her throat. Clearing her throat of the suddenly formed mucus, Jessica tried again. "Why?" Smiling evilly, Ian patiently explained, "That's the genius of it all. By killing you and the hero, Malcolm will remain at sea. You see, there will be no accusations, no excuses, no answers. He won't know why you did it. He'll be consumed by his own thoughts and doubts, wondering, why? At least he won't find out from you. Besides, he won't be able to shake off the anger and madness for all the hurt you've caused him. By obvious reasons. Enjoying his new role, Ian Wilson continued to explain. Jackson, I'm sure Malcolm has grown to love the boy despite the fact that he is not his father. So by destroying him, Malcolm will become even more gutless. There won't even be a fake son to carry on his name. Naturally, the mere presence of his daughter will be a constant reminder to Malcolm of his loss. So I will let her live. Yes, Malcolm will suffer. And there is nothing he can do about it. Nothing. Jessica stood there, clutching her hands uselessly, staring at Ian in horror as he spoke, the words coming off his tongue in what seemed like a foreign language. Shaking her head incredulously, she said, "You can't do that. They'll find out." "Maybe. But I'm willing to bet the cops won't guess anything." Laughing merrily, Ian stepped back and took careful aim at Jackson's motionless figure. "Now it's time to go. No more talking." "Wait," Jessica shouted, jumping up from the floor and lunging at Ian. Raising his head at the same time as Jessica, Ian quickly turned around to point his gun at the enraged woman lunging at him. Her face reflected surprise and that expression that people have when they lose. Jessica fell to the floor. There was a loud tearing and snapping sound, and the apartment seemed to shake. Before Ian could turn to face whoever it was, he heard a loud bang, louder than his own gun, and felt someone punch him in the chest. Ian looked around. For some reason, he was lying on the floor and looking up. However, his vision seemed blurry. Although he could hear voices, he couldn't make out what they were saying. Then there was a loud buzzing sound, and the sound became so loud that Ian tried to cover his ears. But his hands didn't seem to be working. He wanted to sleep so badly. He needed a nap. With a gurgling sound, Ian sank into the deep darkness where he knew a peaceful rest awaited him. Next chapter. Malcolm made it to the condominium on time, even if he broke the speed law a little. Since it was Saturday morning, most of the occupants were still home, which meant he had to look for parking. He spent at least 5 minutes driving around the neighborhood until he found a free spot. As he pulled up to the main entrance, he noticed that the glass front doors were magnetically locked and access was by keycard. You had to be either a resident or a guest of a resident to get in. In addition, there was a horseshoe-shaped security desk opposite the entrance, right in the middle of the main lobby of the building, with a vigilant guard sitting behind the desk. Malcolm knew 2 people who lived in the building, but wasn't sure if they would let him in without question. Getting the guard's attention, Malcolm spoke quickly through the speaker next to the door, explaining that he needed to enter the building. Although the guard listened to Malcolm's story, he refused to let him in. However, as it happened, while Malcolm stood outside wondering how he could get in, and the overly large guard eyed him suspiciously, a tenant came out of one of the lobby elevators. It was one of 2 people Malcolm knew who lived in the building. As soon as the tenant exited the building, Malcolm struck up a conversation with him. "Hey, William. Long time no see." "Damn if it ain't Malcolm Harris. How you doing, buddy?" After exchanging pleasantries for a few seconds, Malcolm quickly explained the situation to William, emphasizing how dire he thought it was. Thinking for a second and slowly rubbing his stubbled jaw, William looked at Malcolm and the desperation that was red in his eyes. Making his decision, William turned to the doors, checked his card, and opened one door, inviting Malcolm in. "Say, Hank, this is Malcolm Harris, a good friend of mine. He thinks there's trouble brewing at the Wilson house. Would you mind taking him over there and checking it out?" "Sir, he's not on Mr. Wilson's guest list. I can't—" Hank began to explain. "Hank, I'm not asking," William said in a quite serious tone. After thinking for a moment, he added, "I take full responsibility for Mr. Harris." The guard went from a sour expression to a grin, but nodded his head in response to William Casey's order. If Casey hadn't been chairman of the building's tenants committee, Hank would have given him the same answer he'd given Malcolm, but, "Yes, sir," the guard said curtly. "Good, thank you, Hank. I knew I could count on you." Turning to Malcolm, William said in a whisper, "Whatever you do, please don't make trouble. Okay, Malcolm?" Nodding in understanding, Malcolm replied, "Sure, no problem at all. You have no idea how grateful I am to you, William. Thank you." Smiling at Malcolm, William said, "Great. Okay, I've got to run. I'll see you guys later." I hope you and the missus are doing well." William disappeared from sight a few seconds later, hurrying off on his errands. Malcolm and Hank eyed each other warily for a couple seconds, then Malcolm growled, "Well, let's go." Before the guard could respond, both men heard the distinctive sound of a gunshot. It was somewhat muffled, but there was no arguing about what it was. The two men exchanged surprised glances and rushed toward the sound. Wilson's apartment happened to be on the first floor and, incidentally, the least expensive of the condominiums. Otherwise, the gunshot might not have been heard by Malcolm and the security guard at all. Just as they pulled up to Wilson's apartment, both men heard an angry shout, then a gunshot, followed a couple seconds later by another. The guard stopped in front of Wilson's apartment door and hesitated, holding the master key card in his hand. Apparently, Hank, upon reflection, had decided discretion was the best option. Malcolm stopped beside the guard and, without hesitation, snatched the master key card from the motionless guard's hand in a smooth, practiced motion, quickly sliding it in and out of the lock before Hank could recover from his surprise and react. The soft click with which the lock opened barely made it to Malcolm's ears before he tried to burst through the door. However, the door had a guard on it, and it was locked. With a loud grunt, Malcolm quickly stepped back and kicked the door hard, just as he had been taught to do long ago in the army. The door swung open and crashed into the wall behind it, deeply imprinting the large handle into the stonework. Malcolm was in the doorway before the door hit the wall. Turning quickly to round the wall separating the entrance, Malcolm easily pulled a pistol from under his shirt and thrust it forward. His mind couldn't believe what appeared before his eyes. Malcolm couldn't perceive what was happening fast enough, but the instant he saw Wilson point the gun, Malcolm pulled the trigger of his own gun. The look of extreme surprise on Wilson's face as he collapsed to the ground where he stood was confirmation enough for Malcolm that he had hit his target. Running up to Wilson, Malcolm tossed the weapon away from the gasping man and then checked on his son's condition. Jackson was breathing, albeit shallowly. Hearing a familiar but still strange sound behind him, he turned and saw the guard pointing an automatic pistol at him. "Call 911," yelled Malcolm, trying to distract the guard and get him to call for help. "I'm going to apply compression." Hank, unaccustomed to such violent drama, decided to do as he was told. It made him feel good that someone else was responsible. Putting his gun in his holster, he grabbed his cell phone and called for help. While Malcolm was administering first aid, he heard the guard's overly loud voice, but he paid no attention to it and quickly looked around. At first, Malcolm couldn't understand what he was seeing, but then he realized his wife was there. Checking to see if she was alive was pointless. No way in the world would Malcolm have thought their relationship would end this way. What Jessica had done to them, he'd done to her. There was no going back. There might be no forgiveness, but as much as he wanted to, he would never hurt Jessica. He felt sorry for his children. And if Malcolm was honest with himself, he would admit that he felt deep sorrow for both himself and Jessica. Suddenly, Malcolm felt his eyes grow hot and a little watery. Shaking his head, he banished any further thoughts of his wife and turned back to Jackson. Throughout all of this, Malcolm never once released the pressure on the wound on his son's shoulder. Carefully, trying not to turn his head so that Jessica's body wasn't visible, Malcolm shifted his gaze to his son. Despite his pallor, Jackson seemed to be breathing without difficulty. Glancing at Hank, Malcolm asked him in a shaky voice, "How soon will the EMTs arrive?" Hank, still on the phone, relayed the question to the 911 operator, who informed him that it was 5 minutes until the ambulance arrived. That was too long. Sighing in frustration, Malcolm thought for a moment before saying in a more even voice, "Perhaps you should go back to the lobby to let the paramedics in. Don't you think so? Time is of the essence for my son." Swearing at his levity and the fact that a man he didn't like at all reminded him of his job, Hank mouthed into the phone as he headed for the exit of the damned apartment and said goodbye. "Don't shoot anyone else." It was said sarcastically, but Malcolm was busy with his own thoughts and paid no attention to Hank's words. It was less than 5 minutes before the first rescuer entered the house. It seemed to Malcolm that hours had passed as he carefully monitored his son's condition. 2 EMTs took over, and Malcolm had nothing to do but watch as one of them checked his son's vitals, placed an IV, and prepared him for transport. They also checked Wilson's condition and found that he was barely alive. The two EMTs separated the two patients between them until the second crew arrived. Once the second medical team arrived and began preparing Wilson for transport, the first team led Jackson out of the building. That's when the police showed up. Malcolm had no sooner left the building, following the gurney carrying Jackson and the two medics, when he saw the guard pointing to a thin man in a wrinkled dark blue suit. A uniformed officer was with him, and several others arrived in their cars, flashing blue lights and blaring sirens as Malcolm watched. And no sooner had Malcolm gotten into the ambulance to go with Jackson to the hospital than a man in a rumpled suit ran up to him and said authoritatively, "Mr. Harris, please wait. I'm Detective Hunt, and I have a few questions for you." Turning to face the policeman, Malcolm looked at him with icy coldness. "I'm sorry, Detective, but my son has been shot and I have to go with him as he's unconscious, and no doubt the medical staff will have questions as well, more so about his medical history." After a long, thoughtful look at Malcolm, the detective slowly nodded his head. "Okay, Mr. Harris, I'll be right over to take your statement. Don't leave the hospital." Without answering anything, Malcolm turned and walked into the waiting ambulance. Next chapter. It was about 6 hours before the detective arrived, accompanied by two uniformed officers. By then, Jackson was out of surgery and resting comfortably. As it turned out, the bullet hadn't hit anything vital, but Jackson was in for a rather long and painful recovery and possibly physical therapy. His son was lucky. Jackson would have a hard time, but the important thing was that his son would be okay. Jackson was now lying unconscious in bed in a private hospital room, and his father was sitting in a very uncomfortable chair next to Jackson's bed. The doctor who was handling Jackson's case said that he would be kept under sedation for a couple days to allow the severe pain to pass before waking him up. Malcolm finally contacted Tricia, who was out of town with friends. He told her about Jackson without mentioning anything about her mother. He waited until she was in front of him, and only then would he tell her. It wasn't exactly kindness, because at the same time, Malcolm hadn't quite come to terms with what he'd seen yet, and probably never would. He wasn't even sure he wanted to. It was a hell of a way to remember the woman he'd once loved as his better half. Tricia would be arriving in another couple hours, and Malcolm knew he needed to get his thoughts together. For himself, for Tricia, and ultimately for Jackson. Malcolm wasn't sure if Jackson knew about his mother's death. Dropping his head in his hands, Malcolm just let his thoughts slip away. It was easier not to think that way. Damn it, he hadn't called Eric. He could have done it now, before Tricia arrived. Malcolm was already reaching for the phone when the police officers opened the door and entered the room. Malcolm didn't have time to do anything but turn around in his chair before the policemen were standing beside him, surrounding him. And the look on their faces was far from friendly. "Mr. Harris, stand up," said the guy who had earlier introduced himself as Detective Hunt sternly. "What?" burst out of Malcolm's mouth before two patrolmen grabbed his arms and lifted him forcefully from his chair. Before Malcolm could protest at this treatment, the two policemen pulled and bent his arms behind his back, dropping him to the floor. They weren't gentle about it either. "What the hell?" Malcolm shouted as someone's knee came down on his neck. "Don't fight back and it'll go easier," yelled one of the policemen standing over him. He also felt something heavy and rough on his spine, right in the middle of his back. Maybe a shoe. "Martin, hurry up. Cuff him. He's trying to break free." Malcolm made no attempt to do so, but nevertheless heard the slide of the automatic pistol go into the safety. He felt rather than saw the gun pointed at him. "Stop fighting. If you don't calm down, you're going to get hurt," said the other policeman. The knee placed against his neck went lower and lower until he heard his vertebrae crunch, the pain quickly increasing until he let out a painful wheeze. Malcolm heard someone step on his head as he lay on the hospital floor, barely able to breathe. "You should have cooperated when you had the chance, Harris. It would have been a lot easier for you. Now, look at you. Unleashed like a hog and ready to be slaughtered." Detective Hunt laughed wickedly. "All right, get him up." Detective Hunt ordered the officers. "Now we're going to take care of these matters. Only at my house. Oh yes, one more little detail. Malcolm Harris, you're under arrest for attempted murder." Even through the fog of disbelief, Malcolm felt even more perplexed by such a nonchalant statement from the policeman. Next chapter. The policeman questioned him for hours. Malcolm did not know how long they questioned him because he did not look at the clock hanging on the wall behind him. There were two reasons for this. First, he was chained to a chair and a table, so his movements were restricted. And second, his neck was very sore, and even if he wasn't chained, he still wouldn't have been able to turn around to look at the clock. From the beginning, Malcolm told the police, especially Detective Hunt, that he needed a lawyer and medical attention. Exactly in that order. The only thing the cops had done was switch interrogators. First, as soon as he made his demands, Hunt left the room, and Malcolm was left alone for a while. Then another detective entered. He stated that he was a health monitor, wanting only to ascertain his mental and physical condition. He introduced himself as Manuel Fernandez without giving his position or rank. He did not appear to be Mexican as he was black. Maybe from Cuba. Hard to tell in these times of globalization, although he spoke with a slight Spanish accent. Fernandez started with the usual questions one asks the wounded, but gradually turned the conversation to what had happened at Wilson's. Of course, the questions were still veiled, thinly veiled with concern. "Come on, kid. I'm trying to help you. Did you get hurt when you smashed the door? Does your shoulder hurt now? Is that when you hurt your neck?" Or, "I bet your neck hurt when you shot Mr. Wilson. You probably didn't mean to shoot him? You don't seem like the kind of person who would shoot someone, at least not on purpose. Your shoulder and neck must have been sore and you accidentally shot him. Is that right? Is that what happened? Does your neck hurt now?" Or, "Man, it's one thing to heal the body, but man, you gotta heal the mind first, so the body can heal faster and right. You know what I mean? The only way to do that is to unburden yourself, man. Free the soul. Free the spirit within you, and then the body starts to heal. Confession is good for the soul. I go to confession every Saturday and I feel new. You know what I mean?" Malcolm, despite the increasing pain that was now spreading to his shoulders and arms, dodged questions, not wanting to be drawn into the deceptive game Fernandez was playing, and repeatedly asked for a lawyer and medical attention. So far, "Detective Fernandez, get out of there, now," said an electronically amplified voice Malcolm had never heard before. Fernandez's eyes went wide with unpleasant surprise, and a second later he literally jumped up from the chair he was sitting in. Without saying a word or making a single gesture toward Malcolm, Fernandez left the room in a nervous rush. Malcolm sat chained, unable to move to take away the shooting pain. With each jolt of pain, he was sent into his own little world, fighting the ever-looming maelstrom of darkness that threatened to suck him into its black depths. Each time Malcolm surfaced, but knew it was only a matter of time before the pain won out, and he succumbed to its onslaught. Maybe that's not such a terrible prospect, Malcolm thought. Next chapter. What the hell is going on? I've heard him ask for a lawyer and medical attention at least 3 times while I've been here. Did you ever call him for a lawyer? Medical attention? The angry man asked, standing in front of the 2 detectives, Emil Hunt and Manuel Fernandez. "Come on, Captain. The guy is dirty, and he was about to break. He was getting ready to confess." "If you hadn't," Hunt complained, but was interrupted when he saw the look on his captain's face. Captain Amos Albright, frowning menacingly, gave Hunt a cold look, then stopped. "Captain, the fellow is faking it. If he had an injury that bad, he'd have passed out from the pain by now. I mean, the guy is just playing with us, you know?" Fernandez chimed in. "And Emil's right. The guy was ready to spill everything he thought. Just a couple more minutes and... I'm done with you 2 bastards. I'm only here because the chief called me at home. He explained, and not very pleasantly, that 2 of my detectives were holding a man hostage without legal representation or any medical attention, despite the fact that the man had asked for both. Repeatedly. The 2 men expressed surprise and concern that the head cop had called their captain. "How did he know? Has he got a rat in the station?" Hunt asked somewhat irritably. Shaking his head, Albright explained to the 2 detectives as if he were talking to children rather than 2 grown men. "Neither of you attended the Friday morning briefing, so you didn't know anything. And since you 2 haven't made any real friends here because of your cowboy ways, no one bothered to bring you up to speed. I'm sure you thought bringing Harris into this room was a smart move. To this particular room because the cameras and communications have been down for weeks. You thought you could ice him until you had a little more time, to break him down. And of course, get that blessed confession. And no one would know about it. especially since there would be no evidence that Harris was even in that room. Am I right? The captain asked in a surprisingly pleasant voice. His gaze, however, remained hard and unyielding. Hunt and Fernandez just stared at the captain, wondering how he knew, as if he could read their minds. It just so happens that last week the techs came in and fixed everything. New cameras, new communication channels, and most importantly, any interrogation that takes place in one of the rooms is now digitally recorded and transmitted to headquarters, where dozens of people sit and monitor the cameras. The cameras turn on automatically when the door to the room is opened and turn off manually when the room is vacated. The detectives now looked at their captain in horror as his words reached them, and they realized their implications. However, Emil Hunt, the senior detective, quickly oriented himself. "Oh, Captain, we did not inflict inhumane treatment on the perpetrator. What did the chief actually see? Just two police officers trying to do their job. We decided, while we waited for his lawyer to show up, to see if there was anything he wanted to tell us. Like Manuel said, there's no indication that he was hurt. Besides, if he was hurt, it happened before we took him into custody." "I've heard enough. This is already being handled by internal affairs. It's out of my jurisdiction," Captain Albright explained. "And before you say anything else, don't. I don't want to hear it, because whatever I hear out of your mouth, I'm going to have to pass it on." "Damn it!" Fernandez exclaimed. "Internal affairs? Isn't that right, Captain? Why did you have to—" Manuel began, but his captain intervened. "I had nothing to do with your surrender. The chief did. And anyway, before I forget," taking a deep breath, Captain Albright said, "Detective First Class Emil Hunt and Detective Third Class Manuel Fernandez, you are officially notified that you are both suspended until IA has completed its investigation and you are brought before the police board. You are both hereby ordered to relinquish all property belonging to the police department, including weapons and body armor that have been issued to you for safekeeping. You are also ordered to leave these premises until further notice." Stunned by what their captain had just said, all they could do was stare at Albright. "Sorry, guys, but this is what happens when you forget to follow protocol." And the chief witnessed it, as did about 30 other people. Sighing, Albright said, more softly and with a calmer expression, "Go home. Go home and call your representative. Get a lawyer. Do whatever you think you need to do, but right now, clear out your desks and lockers and get the hell out of my precinct. Now." They broke eye contact with Albright, and, like men being led to the gallows, turned and began making their way toward the squad to clear their desks and turn in what they needed. Albright watched their slowly receding backs for a while, then sighed again and turned back to the room where the criminal was. It was now up to him to deal with Mr. Harris. No doubt Harris's lawyer, and his boss would serve his ass up to him on a wooden platter. Albright thought he'd better call his wife and let her know he'd be gone soon. Looks like it's going to be another long night. Next chapter. The police had not formally charged Malcolm. Captain Albright and two uniformed officers came in and, removing restraints and chains, apologized to Malcolm for the way he had been treated earlier. An ambulance crew arrived and transported him to the hospital. Malcolm's lawyer was contacted, and when Malcolm told him what had happened to Hunt and Fernandez, the lawyer nearly drooled over the phone. After promising that he wouldn't talk to anyone about what had happened to Wilson, or the cops, or admit to anything, Malcolm hung up, arranging to meet the lawyer at the hospital soon. As it turned out, Malcolm had suffered a sprained disc in his neck, but when Malcolm's lawyer learned of the injury, he practically danced for joy. Remembering the pain Malcolm was in from the injury, he explained that his jubilation was due to the lawsuit he was going to file against the police, the city, and everyone else he could. Malcolm was happy for his lawyer. "So, Rick?" Malcolm asked his attorney, Richard Rantini Santini. "My neck is killing me and I've got a bunch of stuff to do. Jessica's death and all that." "Yeah, I think so. If not, I can send someone else over that needs to be signed," Rick replied. "Again, I'm sorry about what happened to Jessica. I can't imagine how you and the kids feel. Man, I still can't believe it." "Yeah, me neither," Malcolm muttered with mixed feelings. "Well, I'll see you in a few days. If anything changes, I'll let you know. You do the same. Remember, if the cops come here, the first thing you do is call me. Don't talk to them. Call me. When the cops come, call me. Got it?" "Yeah, got it," Malcolm replied, annoyed at the repetition of instructions. After shaking hands and wishing them get well soon, but not too soon, Rick left and Malcolm leaned back in his chair with relief. T had been at the hospital all night and most of today. She was going to be home soon. Malcolm groaned, trying to find a comfortable position that would be less painful because of the pain he was in and the plastic neck brace he wore, an uncomfortable protrusion that chafed endlessly. But the doctor had insisted he wear it for a few days, possibly longer. The doctor wanted him to stay in the hospital for a few days, but Malcolm had too much to do and no one to do it with. So the doctor reluctantly let him go home with a series of dire warnings, the main one being to wear a cervical collar at all times. Malcolm called Eric as soon as he was released from the police, and after explaining the situation, Eric quickly agreed to take full charge of the company until Malcolm could return to his duties. Eric also offered to help in any other capacity if needed. Malcolm appreciated the offer and what was behind it, but told Eric that it was settled. Now he had to face his daughter and somehow explain to her how and why her mother had died. Knowing Trisha, there was no way around the why question. She would insist on an explanation. Why had her mother gone to Wilson's house that morning? Why had Wilson killed her? And why had he shot and nearly killed her brother? While Malcolm was sure he could answer some of these questions, he couldn't be absolutely sure why Wilson had plotted such a long and horrible deception that ended in murder. At least Claire hadn't arrived yet, and he had to be grateful for that. Exactly. Malcolm wished she hadn't come into their lives. All that shit happened when she came back? No. That wasn't quite right, to be honest. Jessica had been seeing Wilson all those years. Maybe that's who Claire had meant when she said Jessica was dating him. Ian Wilson. How he hated that bloody bastard. If anyone should be dead, it should be that bastard. How I wish that bastard had drowned that day, Malcolm thought, and his mood became even darker than it had been before Ian Wilson, and even Claire, had appeared in his mind. Even as this new deep hatred took root in his being, Malcolm felt something else quickly rise up and overwhelm him in a sudden surge. Despair swept over him headlong, and his heart seemed to flutter. If he could have leaned forward and rested his head on his hands, Malcolm would have done so, but the device surrounding his neck prevented him from doing so. He had to lean his head back on the cushion built into the chair, even as tears of sadness rushed from his tightly closed eyes. There were no loud sobs, no choked breaths, nothing to indicate the heartache he was experiencing except for the tears slowly streaming down his haggard face. Why, Jessica? Why couldn't you be happy with me? What was I missing that you were looking for in another? What did I do for you? Why did you have a damn affair with that bastard Wilson? What had started as a barely audible whisper grew to a crescendo until the last question came with a resounding shout. He half expected an answer. Only silence answered. Next chapter. The explanation with Trisha was worse than Malcolm could have imagined. First came shock and her inability to react or respond to what her father was telling her. Then came the anger, and she lashed out at Malcolm, furious at him, at her mother, and at Ian. Then came the immense pain that came with the recognition that it was impossible to deny the facts. Trisha had fallen into despondency. Her mom was dead, and nothing could change that. Jessica wasn't coming back. After that, she cried in Malcolm's arms for what seemed like hours, though it was really only a few minutes. A short time later, Claire appeared. Like a whirlwind, she burst into the house and disrupted everything. Still, there was some order in Claire's presence, though Malcolm could hardly stand his late wife's sister. She took over almost immediately, cooking, washing clothes, cleaning, and doing whatever else Trisha required. Malcolm was surprised, but it wasn't enough to overcome his irritation at Claire's presence. Who would have thought Claire could be so domestic? He certainly wouldn't have guessed, Malcolm grumbled to himself. Another thing that annoyed him was that not once had Malcolm noticed her emotional reaction to his sister's death. Of course, everyone reacted differently to death, but he wondered how Claire could be so calm about her sister's death, not shedding a single tear as she comforted Trisha. Eventually, Trisha calmed down and went to sleep in her room. Malcolm had too many thoughts on his mind, and his neck was starting to ache mercilessly, and he couldn't sleep. So he sat in his chair, trying to make sense of the pieces that had become his life, and stared dumbly at the wall in front of his eyes. She'll be fine, Malcolm. Trisha is a strong young woman, just like her mother. And her father. Claire said tiredly, entering the room and interrupting his gloomy musings. Grumbling in response, Malcolm continued to stare straight ahead, trying his best to ignore Claire's intrusion. Walking slowly around his chair so as not to startle her brother-in-law, Claire entered his field of vision. Clearing her throat, she looked resolutely into his eyes and said softly in a voice softened by fatigue and something else, "I'm sorry, Malcolm." Malcolm shifted his gaze to her and felt surprised for a brief moment, then shifted his gaze back to the wall. His face was like granite, and his eyes glittered in the dim light of the den. Claire couldn't understand the effect her words had on him, but still felt she had to continue. Say, Trisha told me that Jackson is going to make a full recovery. I'm so relieved. I couldn't have imagined. Well, I'm just glad. I'll visit him sometime in the morning. If that's okay with you. I'm not trying to interfere, Malcolm, but he's my nephew and Trisha is my niece and I want to help. Help as much as I can. Where have you been all these years, you goddamn whore? And now you want to take care of my family? What about your sister, bitch? Malcolm asked quietly. Or don't you care about her? As if reading his thoughts, Claire replied somewhat uncertainly. I'd like to attend Jessica's funeral too. Things were hanging in the balance between us before I left. I wish it was over. If you say you don't want me there, I'll still go, but I'll stay away from everyone. She was my sister, even if I didn't treat her like a sister. Nay, it seemed nothing could move the mountain named Malcolm. Claire could see that whatever effect her words were having was hidden inside the silent man. I guess I'll be going now. I still have to get a hotel room and it's getting late, Claire explained as she left the room. Good night, Malcolm. And no sooner had she left the room than she heard her brother-in-law say something. Wait! Claire, surprised by his abrupt and rude word, stopped and turned around, curious as to what else he had to say. It's getting late. We have a couple spare bedrooms you can use. You can stay the night or not. It's your choice. But if Trisha needs you, it would be best to have you on hand. Malcolm spoke in a detached voice. You could even say it was a voice devoid of any emotion, and his posture matched his words as he didn't move. He continued to stare straight ahead of him. If Claire had been facing him, she could have seen a suspiciously tear-like tear roll down his face. After thinking for a bit, Claire nodded her head, mostly to herself, as if agreeing with Malcolm's words, but she was thinking about something else. All right, Malcolm, thank you. I think I'll stay. I'll see you in the morning. Good night. Claire, hearing Malcolm's confession, smiled sadly. Next chapter. Ashes, ashes to ashes, waiting for that blessed hope when the Lord himself comes down from heaven. On the day of Jessica's funeral, there was a thunderstorm. The funeral home had erected a large tarpaulin canopy for guests and relatives, the largest available, but as more and more people arrived, they filled the tent and crowded it to the brim. Malcolm, Trisha, Claire, and the few aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters of Jessica's parents, barely sheltered under the canopy, settling into chairs. The church service was unusually long and had been going on for over an hour. It seemed that everyone present had something to say, and they all wanted their time on the church podium. Finally, the funeral director stood up and very bluntly announced that their time was up. Another funeral service was pending at the church. They needed to get out and move on to the burial site. At the burial site, as the rain whipped around under the awning and a strong wind came in from time to time, the priest hurriedly read his prepared eulogy. As soon as he finished, the priest hurriedly left. No one else was willing to brave the elements and speak the last words that were now pouring from the makeshift pavilion, and those gathered quickly dispersed to their homes, hurrying to their parked cars. Only Malcolm, Trisha, Jackson in his wheelchair, Claire, Eric, and a couple other friends, Mona and Roy, remained. Mona was fine, but Roy was a pain in the ass, Malcolm thought, thanking them for their presence and comforting words. Roy never knew when to stop talking, and would have kept going on and on about other people he knew, dying people, and how their funerals had gone if Mona hadn't tugged on his sleeve and told her husband they were leaving. I'm sorry, Malcolm. Roy gapes like a 5-mile-long train and it takes him forever to stop, Mona said, half explaining and half apologizing. Ignoring Roy's protests, Mona continued. And like the lost tribe of Israel, he is forever wandering. Ignoring Roy's slip of the tongue, Malcolm replied, Thank you and Roy for coming to Jessica's funeral. We all appreciate it. Of course, we sympathize with you and your loved ones. Also, if there's anything we can do to help, Mona didn't elaborate, certain that Malcolm would never ask for their help. His pride was too great for that. Thank you for the offer, Mona. I'll be there if I need to be, Malcolm replied machine-like without thinking about it. We'll be fine. Okay, Malcolm, but I'll check on you from time to time, Mona assured him, then lowered her voice thoughtfully so that only Malcolm could hear her words. She's in terrible pain, Mal. She's really hurting. Assuming she was talking about Trisha, Malcolm, also lowering his voice, replied, Trisha's going to be fine. Even though she's had a rough time, she'll come around eventually. Thank you for your concern, Mona. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, but Mona quickly replied in agreement. Oh, I'm sure you're right. Trisha is a stand-up girl. Taking a breath, Mona, as if stepping into a minefield, said with slight misgiving, I meant Claire. Malcolm stared at Mona for a moment, then averted his eyes and lowered his head, almost fearfully, as if she had suddenly turned into Medusa. In a cold voice, almost devoid of emotion, he said, I don't know. Mel, please, listen to me. She has no one. Her folks died and were buried years ago. Her sister more recently. The rest of her relatives want nothing to do with her. The only family she has left is you and your children, Mona whispered, urgently, almost pleadingly. And still refusing to look her in the eye for fear that this kind woman would see him as a monster, Malcolm replied in a harsh whisper. Mona, I don't care. She's no kin to me, as far as I'm concerned. He was about to say, Claire could join her sister in the land. But his brain finally switched on, and the realization of what he'd almost said hit a sore nerve. Was he really as much of a monster as he thought he was? Did he really want Claire dead? He didn't know. His life was running in a kaleidoscopic tunnel. His emotions were racing through that same tunnel. Had he really changed to the point where the death of a person had become commonplace to him? Malcolm didn't know, but it was up to him to find the answers to those questions. Maybe when things settled down and Wilson was dealt with, then he could get the peace he needed to figure everything else out. In the meantime, continuing what he'd started, which took less than half a breath, Malcolm continued. She can stay here as long as she needs to, but I hope she doesn't. Mona scrutinized his face, then nodded. You're a good man, Malcolm Harris. For some reason, Mona's statement made him deeply ashamed, and all he could do was nod in silent acknowledgement. It's time for us to go. Once again, I'm sorry for your loss. Now you remember, if you need anything, and don't let your pride get in the way of calling, Mona admonished as she stepped toward her husband, took his hand, opened her umbrella, and led him to the car. Malcolm stared after them for a while, regretting that his life had turned out the way the Leonards had. There was no doubt in anyone's mind how much Mona and Roy loved each other. Suddenly, Malcolm realized that part of his annoyance with Roy was due to jealousy, and perhaps even envy. Mona would never cheat on Roy. Moreover, Malcolm couldn't imagine that such a thing could happen. Besides, Roy was many things, but one thing he was definitely not was a cheater. Then again, Malcolm couldn't imagine a scenario where Roy cheated on Mona. Shaking his head in amazement at such a pairing, Malcolm turned to look at his children. They seemed to be engaged in deep conversation with Claire. Eric, who was standing almost in the very center of the canopy, trying to shield himself from the wind-blown rain, was looking at something intently on his cell phone. Eric was always researching something, making deals, or reading on his cell phone when he couldn't sit at his office or home computer. Looking at his children and his partner, Malcolm thought that despite Jessica's betrayal and Wilson's murder of her and Claire's unwanted presence, he had to admit that he had to appreciate what he had. After all, it wasn't all bad. All in all, it wasn't. Next chapter. He came to his senses from a symphony of pain. He heard a distant squeak and a sharp gurgle. Neither of those sounds reached his brain. He was still too caught up in the physical suffering to comprehend anything. And then, a final memory came over him. He smiled, or tried to smile. He saw Jessica Harris's shattered head again. Most of her skull had simply shattered into pieces, leaving a huge hole in her head, created by the explosive impact of a bullet that had come from the side. And then, there was nothing after that. His memory was just blank until he woke up a moment ago. He thought he heard someone screaming, but it could have been echoes of memories. Hadn't Jessica screamed when her top was ripped off? He wasn't sure, however, the thought made him smile. He felt rather than saw or heard someone near him, but he couldn't open his eyes. They remained closed, as if they had been welded shut. He thought he heard voices, but the words drew nearer and nearer, then farther away. Had they never gotten close enough to taste? No, to something else. He heard the screams getting clearer and perhaps louder. Whoever it was, he wished they would shut up. Eventually, he felt an overwhelming drowsiness come over him, to pull him back into its dark but peaceful depths. Next chapter. Stop worrying, Dad. There's nothing wrong with me, or would be fine if you didn't ask me how I'm feeling every 5 minutes, a frustrated Jackson muttered. I really am. Really. Good. After giving his son a long look, Malcolm nodded his head in acknowledgement. Tricia, standing nearby, added her opinion. Come on, Dad. Jackson's fine. He's on the mend. You're the one who won't be doing so well if you don't get some rest. You need sleep. A lot of it. I'm going to stay with Jackson, okay? But, Malcolm started, but was interrupted by Tricia. No buts, Daddy. Now go upstairs and get some rest. I'll wake you up if anything happens. Shaking his head at his children's stubbornness, Malcolm laughed and said, Okay, good. You've all won. I'm out of here. It had been 3 weeks since that terrible day. Even though Malcolm had pretty much broken up with Jessica by now, he had experienced her loss as deeply and painfully as he had his children. How could he not? He'd been married to their mother for years. It was one thing to get a divorce and quite another to realize that she would never grace their children's lives again. Her death took everyone by surprise. His statement to the police about self-defense was met with disbelief. And the worst part was that Wilson, before passing out from blood loss, claimed that Malcolm Harris was involved and had shot him while he, Ian Wilson, was defending himself against the other Jackson and his mother. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Malcolm couldn't help but think back to that horrible morning. If he had gotten there a minute or two earlier, perhaps things would have turned out differently. No sooner had he reached the top step than the doorbell rang. No doubt it was some well-wisher coming to see how things were going. Since the funeral, most people he knew had stopped by at least once. Some, like Mona Leonard, dropped in twice a week. Without paying much attention to who was at the door, Malcolm headed for his bedroom, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized the kids were right. He wasn't getting enough sleep. He really needed to get more rest. Maybe he would go to the family doctor and get something that would put him to sleep and keep him awake. When he got to his bedroom, Malcolm felt the bed calling to him, and just as he was about to lie down, Tricia walked in behind him. Dad, I hate to bother you, but the police are here. They want to talk to you. I'm so sorry, Daddy. I tried to tell them you were resting, but they said it was important for them to talk to you right now, Tricia said somewhat nervously. Malcolm turned around abruptly. Without reacting to his daughter's statement, he told her softly, It's okay, T. I'm sure it's just a formality. They'll ask their questions and leave. Tricia smiled weakly and replied, Maybe you're right, Daddy. Smiling at his daughter, he walked down the stairs. Yes, officers? What can I do for you? Malcolm asked the 2 military men standing on the porch. Malcolm Harris? One of the officers asked, trying to speak in an official tone. Yes, that's me, Malcolm confirmed, frowning at the officer's formality. I'm Officer Harvey, and this is Officer Muldoon. We'd like to have a word with you. Would you mind stepping outside, sir? Although the question was asked in the form of a question, it was obvious from the tone that it was an order. After making sure they had given their names on the name tags, and without arguing or objecting, Malcolm stepped out onto the porch in silence. Do you have a photo ID? The same officer asked. Without answering, Malcolm reached for the wallet in his back pocket. He held out his driver's license to the man identified as Harvey. After examining it and then scanning it on the portable scanner attached to his belt, he handed the license back to Malcolm. Noticing the questioning look on Malcolm's face, the second cop, Muldoon, grinned and explained, This is the newest gadget the department is testing. It scans driver's licenses, calculates the information, and then we can print tickets instead of writing them out. Quickly check for availability of willing applicants, which used to take some time because you had to search several separate databases. It can do a lot of things and reduce the time we spend with pen and paper, but in your case, it's just registering that we've met with you. Oh, I suppose that's convenient, Malcolm said carelessly. Noticing the criminal's sluggish response, Harvey intervened before his partner, Thomas Muldoon, could begin to explain the advantages of using the device. Mr. Harris, we're here to ask you some questions regarding the shooting of Ian Wilson. We just need to clear up some loose ends that have come up during the investigation. Do you mind? Without hesitation, Malcolm replied, No, I don't mind. Not without my attorney present during the interrogation. Sorry, guys, but that's the way it has to be. Harvey's eyes flashed with anger, just for a moment, though his face remained impassive, and he forced himself to let it go. It still annoyed him how criminals could so easily escape responsibility for their actions by simply saying they needed to call a lawyer. But, I understand. Then, by all means, please call your lawyer. We'll wait here. The officer's last sentence made Malcolm a little uneasy, and he frowned as he pondered the officer's possible intentions. I'm sorry, officers, but unless you have a warrant, I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside my property. Just in case you haven't noticed, I call your attention to the fact that there are several private property, no trespassing notices posted around the perimeter of my property. Officer Muldoon looked at his partner, making sure he didn't explode at this resistance from the criminal. Seeing that Harvey was still in control of the situation, he turned to the criminal. Sir, you don't have a choice. We're not trespassing because trespassing laws don't apply to officers in the line of duty. I see. But do they apply when you have no reason to? Besides, you had to either jump the cyclone fence or pick the lock on the gate to get onto my property. I can check the videotape to see which of those methods you and Officer Harvey used. Do I need to do that? After listening to Malcolm, the police officers felt uneasy, but they still didn't look convinced. Officers, there is a right to privacy on private property, even for law enforcement officers, unless a crime is being committed on private property or officers are pursuing criminals. However, a no trespassing sign is usually not enough to guarantee this expectation when officers of the law are involved. That's why locked gates, a fence, and surveillance are needed. The only thing missing in my quest for a no trespassing policy is guard dogs patrolling the grounds, or armed guards. Do you see where I'm going with this? Both men were ready to argue, but neither knew how to ground their arguments within the law, given the situation. Then they noticed the perp pointing to one corner of their porch. I have several cameras mounted on the outside of my house. They are all high definition, with night vision and microphones. So yes, we are being recorded. The live recording is sent to my server and to a cloud service. So once again, I say you can wait outside my property while I call my attorney. Mr. Harris, why is it a problem for me and Officer Harvey to wait on your porch? Do you have something to hide? Muldoon asked with challenge in his voice. Malcolm, looking curiously at the two officers, readily replied, We all have something to hide, even you officers. If you are married and cheating on your wives, do you want them to know about it? Of course you wouldn't. You would hide that fact, Malcolm explained, putting emphasis on the words conceal and fact. I could go on, but the point is that the law allows me to expect privacy on my own property, and I exercise that right. Nothing more is needed. Just as Malcolm finished speaking, Tricia appeared in the doorway and spoke a little too loudly. Daddy, Captain Albright is on the phone. He's on his way, but he wants to talk to you. Raising a questioning eyebrow, Malcolm said, I need to talk to your boss. Unless you want me to tell him about my rights and how I think you're all trampling on them, I suggest you go back to the car and wait there. With an intermittent sigh, Harvey said wryly, Come on, Tom. We don't want to trample on anybody's rights. As he spoke, Harvey was already descending the steps. Nodding in response, Officer Muldoon walked with Officer Harvey toward their car. Muldoon stopped and turned to say something to Malcolm, but changed his mind and continued toward the gate in the yard fence. Throwing one last glance at the officers to make sure they were indeed heading back to their car, Malcolm shook his head and walked into the house. Yes, this is Malcolm Harris, Captain Albright. Mr. Harris, are these two officers still in your house? The captain asked without any preamble of greeting. Yes, sir, they are. Good. I want to talk to them when I get there. Now, Mr. Harris, I need you to stay put as well. We have a new development involving your wife's death. and I really need to discuss it with you, Albright said. Understood, Malcolm replied somewhat warily. I will need my attorney present, Captain. There was a moment of silence before the policeman replied. Mr. Harris, I cannot advise you one way or the other. What I can say, however, is that if you feel you need the presence of your attorney, I cannot forbid you from bringing him along. Good. I think you have adequately answered my question. I'll see you when you arrive, Captain Albright. Yes, sir, the police captain replied, and hung up. The tone of Albright's voice was controlled, even neutral and extremely cordial. Of course, Malcolm thought, this could be because the captain was being cautious and didn't want a repeat of what had happened in Malcolm's previous experience with cops. Nevertheless, it only added to Malcolm's anxiety. Did you call my lawyer? Richard Santini? Malcolm inquired. Yes, of course I called him. You said so yourself. Why? Don't you want him here? Tricia asked, concerned that she might have misheard her father asking her to call his lawyer. Yes, I want him to. Didn't Rick say when he was coming? No, I haven't talked to him. I left a message on his voicemail, Tricia said, her anxiety growing. Only now it was anxiety for her father. Dad, are the police going to arrest you again? I don't know. I have no idea what Albright wants to talk about. Just told me to wait for him. Papa, Tricia, shouted Jackson excitedly from the couch. He was leaning on his good arm. Come here. Father and daughter rushed over to Jackson. What happened? Are you okay, son? A concerned Malcolm asked. Yeah, I'm fine. It's just that Tricia reminded me of something, said an agitated Jackson. What is it, Jackson? What did I remind you of? His sister inquired. About my phone. Jackson rambled. On my phone, I recorded what happened. I mean at Wilson's house. I wrote it all down. I think. What? What do you mean you think? You're not sure? The suddenly tense father asked. No. I had forgotten about it until Trish reminded me with her comment about leaving a voicemail for your lawyer, said a suddenly saddened Jackson. Since that day, I've hardly needed the phone at all. I mean, I was out of it with the painkillers and everything. I didn't check to see if it recorded anything. Both his sister and father just stared at him. Okay, Jackson, let's not get our hopes up, but if he recorded audio, he might have something to use. Trish, could you grab my phone? I think I left it on the kitchen table, her brother asked. Tricia, bouncing on her socks, ran into the kitchen, overflowing with hope and almost floating. There he is, Jackson. Come on, hurry up. The cops are on their way. Not bothering to answer, Jackson picked up his phone and began to swiftly swipe his index finger across the screen. Oh yeah, he recorded almost 3 hours of audio before the battery died. Come on, hurry up, his sister asked. Yes. Me. Hold on. Here's the folder, exclaimed Jackson triumphantly. At that moment they heard the heels of boots screeching on the porch steps outside. Albright had arrived. Hold on, Jackson. Give the phone to your sister, now. Malcolm ordered in a calm but unobjectionable tone. Huh? No way, Jackson protested. Before Malcolm could respond, they heard the door open. Mr. Harris, I need to speak with you. It's urgent, Captain Albright said in a very serious tone. Come in, Captain, Malcolm greeted him, looking at his son and silently begging Jackson to follow his words. We're in the parlor. Oh, you're already there. Yes, sir. I'm afraid that's not good news. Sighing sympathetically, Albright said almost reluctantly, I have a warrant for your arrest, Mr. Harris, and another for your son, Jackson Harris. At the mention of his name in connection with the arrest, Jackson squeaked in surprise. Me? What have I done? Glancing at the young man lying on the couch with a heavy and bulging bandage around his torso, he spoke into the radio. We need medical transportation to... The police captain relayed the necessary information to the dispatcher. Mr. Harris, will you volunteer to come? Because from what I've heard, you were acting a little rough earlier, the captain asked in an unfriendly voice. One could almost hear the amusement in his tone. Yes, I will come in peace, but I would ask that you wait until the medical transport arrives so I can make sure my son is properly cared for. After thinking for a moment, Captain Albright shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing and said, I don't think that will be a problem. We will have to handcuff you, however, Standard procedure. Shrugging, Malcolm said, I understand. And having said that, he turned, putting his hands behind his back. Jackson, give Trisha her cell phone. Huh? It's my... Jackson began pitifully. Jackson, you can look at the pictures when you get out on bail, but for now, Trisha needs her phone, Malcolm explained patiently, hoping his son would stop being so stupid and realize that the worst that could happen right now was that the police would take his phone. Giving his father a perplexed look, Jackson slowly handed the phone to his sister. Trisha, try calling Santini again. Keep trying until you get through to him. Tell him what's going on. Taking her brother's cell phone in her hands, she headed to the desk to dial the lawyer's number one more time. Entering his number, she waited for the voicemail to go to voicemail. But after the third ring, a live voice came on. Richard Santini, how can I help you? The lawyer answered in a rich baritone. Trisha quickly explained who she was in the situation, but made no mention of the audio file. Hanging up the phone, she informed Malcolm that his lawyer was on his way and would meet him at the jail. By this time, transportation had arrived for Jackson, and the police were busy securing him on a gurney. I'm sorry, Mr. Harris, Captain Albright spoke. It's not my place to arrest you or your son. A complaint was filed against you and your son several weeks ago, but we haven't been able to verify it with the complainant. Just yesterday, the complainant came forward, and we were able to verify his original complaint. The district attorney has charged you with breaking and entering, attempted murder, unlawful use of a weapon within city limits, trespassing on private property, intimidation of citizens, and malice aforethought. Malcolm was shocked, to say the least, at the numerous charges against him. Of course, he knew who the unknown complainant was, but he didn't understand why Wilson was going after Jackson. Next chapter. Damn it! Why didn't you hand us that tape sooner? You could have avoided a lot of legal trouble, Mr. Harris, Captain Albright said, anger in his voice. As I said, I didn't, Malcolm began, but his attorney Richard Santini interrupted him. I think my client has already explained everything. The facts in this story won't change from you asking the same question over and over again. The tension in the courtroom was quite palpable, and it didn't help that Harris's attorney, Rantini, was constantly supplementing his client's words with his own rebuttals. Okay, good, fine. You didn't know it existed before we arrested you. But frankly, it sounds awfully convenient. And I'd say, like it was planned. Anyway, Captain, even my son didn't remember he had it until his sister said something that reminded him of it. So take it or don't take it. That's what happened. Look, Captain Albright, my client's son is willing to give up his phone with the original audio file. The only thing someone did was download a copy of the recording, and that was me. But I didn't listen to it either. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, no one has heard the recording since its existence became known, Santini explained. Pondering Rantini's words, Albright ran his hand over his face, trying to wipe away the fatigue he felt. Coming to some sort of decision, Albright said, All right, hand over the phone, my lab will process it and... Whoa, Captain, how long will that take? I'm guessing your lab is probably covered in snow, so they won't be able to get to it for a while. Am I right? Looking at the lawyer for interrupting him and pointing out one of the disadvantages he was facing, he replied in a tightly controlled voice. I don't know, Mr. Santini. I'm sure we can speed up the process. Why do you want to know that? Instead of answering the policeman's question, Santini opened his attached C case and pulled several items from there, including a laptop computer. Captain, here's the phone in question. With those words, Santini held out a clear plastic evidence bag to the police officer. Attached to the outside of the bag was a piece of paper with a small but neatly printed inscription. As you can see, attached to the phone is a chain of custody log. To the best of my knowledge, this is a true and honest list of the chain of custody. Santini then picked up a thumb drive. On this USB drive is a copy of the recording that we can listen to right now, if you'll allow it. And I humbly request to listen to it, the lawyer said with a straight face. Frowning, the captain stared at the small device and held out a plastic bag to him. Yes? How do I know the audio file hasn't been tampered with? Albright asked, wary of anything the lawyer offered, especially without conditions. Showing no offense, Harris's attorney said, I asked the technician to transfer the file for me. His name, date, and time are recorded in the chain of custody. He didn't have access to any other files, images, videos, or apps on the phone. But your technicians can review the phone, and I'm sure they can determine if there has been any tampering since the day the audio was recorded. Albright looked at the two men sitting across from him. Naturally, the lawyer looked calm as a cucumber. Harris was not as calm. He seemed agitated and perhaps even haunted by what was stored on the disk. As Malcolm's nervous glance at the small disk showed the policeman. "All right, let's hear it." No one spoke as Santini turned on the laptop and inserted the flash drive into the slot on the side of the computer. Like I said, no one has heard the audio of this file. It's in its raw form, thus no editing. We're not even sure if there's anything intelligible in it. After a brief pause, Santini looked at Malcolm and patted him lightly on the shoulder with more emotion than he had so far, saying quietly, "Whatever you hear, be strong, Malcolm. Be strong." Turning to face the policeman, Santini asked, "Ready?" Albright nodded and replied, "Yes. Play." Malcolm replied curtly, "Yeah." There was a series of unidentifiable sounds, lasting a moment, then a few muffled and distorted, but despite all that, heard quite clearly. "Forget what I said, you stupid whore, I just—" All three men listened as the events of nearly 4 weeks ago unfolded. As each word was spoken and emotions built up, Malcolm felt helpless in the face of what had already happened, but at the same time he felt like he had to do something to stop it. At times, Malcolm winced in bewilderment at what was being said, though his face remained almost expressionless with tears streaming down his face. They heard the first gunshot, and Malcolm nearly jumped up from his chair. He knew his son had just been shot. Even though Jackson was all right, the mere thought of his son being shot caused Malcolm an overwhelming dread that filled him to the brim. Hearing it was far worse. None of the men could believe the cold-blooded words spoken by Wilson so calmly and deliberately. Even Albright was shocked at the glee with which Wilson was explaining what he was going to do to his victims. Then they heard Jessica Harris shout, "Wait!" followed by a loud gunshot. Wilson spoke again, and again the gunshot rang out. The policeman even flinched when he heard it. He knew what it meant. Then they heard what must have been a door swing open, a surprised Wilson shout something, and another shot. Albright looked at Harris as the tape continued. The tears had stopped, but he could still make out the streaks left on Harris's cheeks. Embarrassed, the policeman looked away. They finished listening to the tape before all three of them realized it was over. Malcolm more than once wanted to yell for the tape to be turned off, but somehow restrained himself, even though he felt like someone had stabbed what was left of his heart. Richard Santini was simply shocked at what the recording contained, but at the same time he felt a sense of satisfaction and knew that his clients were innocent. Though he didn't usually care about that, he was glad that Malcolm and his son were innocent, and would be released. Listening to the tape, Captain Albright felt a sympathy for Malcolm Harris that he had never felt for a suspect before. It mattered when he heard how the case really played out. He did sympathize with Harris for what his wife had done to him along with Wilson, and for the way she had died. But he also had a job to do. "Well?" Santini asked the policeman. That one-word question was filled with heavy meaning, and Albright knew what Santini and, ultimately, Harris wanted. "It's been very informative, but it will take a few days to clear things up, and if the audio file checks out, Mr. Harris and his son will be cleared of the charges in a couple of days. I'll personally take the phone to the lab and sit on it until they check it out. In the meantime, I'll go to the DA and give him a copy. I can't say he'll take the case right away, but I think we can get Mr. Harris a get-out-of-jail-free card. I doubt he'll be spending the night. Is that okay with you, counselor?" After considering the cop's offer, Santini looked at Malcolm. "What do you say? Do you want to go along with it?" Shrugging his shoulders, Malcolm replied, "Sure, as long as my son is included in the deal." Harris and Santini looked at the policeman expectantly. With an exaggerated sigh, Albright said, "That's what I thought, so yes, he's part of the deal. But he'll still be questioned about the specifics of the recording. Is that clear?" "Of course, I understand. But I do have one request," Malcolm said in a surreptitious voice, still recovering from his impressions of the recording. "Don't press him, Mr. Harris. You're sitting free right now, but the district attorney can bring other charges against you. Your attorney can inform you of that," Captain Albright warned, tapping his finger on the warrant. Anyway, what's this about? Giving the policeman a glance, Malcolm said, "When you arrest that son of a bitch, I want to be there. I want to be with him for at least a minute before they take him away, or whatever it is you're going to do to him." "Malcolm," the counselor interrupted him, "I don't think that's a good idea. What do you want with this man? He's already explained his goals and motives on the tape." "I know, Richard, but I need to meet with him." Without taking his eyes off Albright, Malcolm said encouragingly, "I'm not going to shoot him or anything. I just need to talk to him. Do you understand what I'm saying?" After a second's hesitation, the captain nodded slowly. "I think so. But even knowing that, I can't risk you snapping and doing something we'll all regret. So I have to say no." At this point, Richard Santini spoke with some relief. "Well, now that that's settled, I can—" Malcolm Harris made no apologies and recounted everything his lawyer was about to ask. "Can I visit him in jail, maybe before the trial?" Malcolm asked, keeping his eyes on the policeman. Albright saw a man in a lot of pain, but he also saw a man with a great need for revenge, and as long as it didn't involve murder, he was willing to help in any way he could. Yes, the police captain did understand him. If the roles had been reversed, Albright doubted he would have been able to hold back the way Harris did. Wilson would be dead, and by a factor of 10. Harris, however, needed his pound of flesh, even if it was only a verbal exchange. "I think we can work something out if it's just a prison visit." "Thanks." For the first time, Malcolm smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was a hard, malicious smile that barely showed his teeth, but it was a frightening expression on a stern, grim face. The lawyer looked at the police captain, saw the same expression on the face of this honorable man, and could not help shuddering at the grim promise that smile held. Epilogue. It was now more than 7 months since the events of that fateful day. Ian Wilson was very surprised when several police officers entered his room, announced that he had been arrested, read the formal charges, and then handcuffed him to the railing of his hospital bed. A few weeks later, he was transferred to the hospital ward of the prison, where he finished recuperating. Now Ian Wilson sat on a bunk in his 4-man cell, rereading for the 100th time the few pages of the letter he held in his hands. Hands that had once been unshakable but now trembled, like branches swept by a gale. The letter was from his lawyer. He had received it 9 days ago. There was no good news. No matter how many times he reread it, the meaning didn't change. When he sorted through the legal babble, the letter simply stated that his cash holdings, which totaled over $10 million, as well as all of his real estate and investments totaling nearly $18 million, were frozen. $28 million, and he couldn't touch a single dollar, which meant, for all intents and purposes, that he was broke. A sum invested in his life's work, and he couldn't access any of it. Naturally, his lawyers had tried to get some of that money, if only to pay for his defense. So far, their efforts had been unsuccessful. What really pissed Ian off was that the man who had the money frozen was Malcolm Harris. Harris had filed a wrongful death suit against his wife, and the judge had frozen Ian's accounts so no one could transfer them until the case was heard. Maybe when he gets out, he'll pay Malcolm Harris a visit. Yes, that would be... His vengeful thoughts, though pleasant, were interrupted by a guard announcing that he had a visitor. After shackles were placed on Ian's wrists and ankles, he was led out. The prison guards led him past a small room with 3 monitors and cameras normally used for video visits. Ah, so one of his lawyers was here, Ian thought. They must have some news. Either they'd managed to get that damned audio file thrown out, or somehow they'd managed to get some of the funds released. He hoped it would be both, but maybe that was too much to ask. Or maybe it wasn't. Ian felt a cold smile appear on his face, albeit a wicked one. The guard accompanying him stopped Ian in front of a heavy metal door. It had a glass window cut into it with a wire. Another guard unlocked the door and, once inside, sat Ian on a metal chair firmly anchored to the floor. One guard watched the other as he fastened Ian's metal restraints to metal rings embedded in the stainless steel table and concrete floor. After visually checking his work, one guard tested each ring by yanking it hard, and both guards, satisfied, left the room, leaving Ian alone. Neither guard said anything, and neither did Ian. Ian quickly learned that talking to guards, other than to fulfill basic needs, was a bad idea. Talking to the guards, if these tin gods in uniform even deigned to speak to a humble prisoner, could easily be perceived by the other prisoners as snitching. Regardless of what the prisoner was called, he was never trusted again. And worst of all, no one would be friends with you. No one would have your back. Ian had learned, adapted, and even succeeded in how to survive in prison. Now he might not have to endure this life for long. So it was with some impatience and hope that he waited for his lawyer. After an indeterminate amount of time, as waiting alone, in silence, with no extraneous thoughts, tends to distort the passage of time, the large metal door on the opposite side of the room opened. A guard entered it and stood at the side of the door. Ian heard the door open and slam shut behind him. When he looked back, he saw that a guard had entered and positioned himself the same way as the other guard in front of him. This was different. Ian had met with his lawyers 3 times now, and after being secured, the guards would leave to give him a chance to talk to his lawyers alone. So it wasn't his lawyers who had come to see him. This new situation filled Ian with a detached curiosity that, for the moment, slightly diluted the monotony of his day's confinement. Wilson heard the far door slam shut with a metallic clang. Then the door directly in front of him swung open, and his visitor entered the room. Malcolm Harris. It seemed to Wilson that he should have guessed the identity of his mysterious visitor, but he was too consumed with his own problems to fully concentrate, so he simply assumed. However, the appearance of the cuckolded man was inevitable. An evil smile appeared on Ian's face. Well, unless it's Jessica's cuckolded husband, Malcolm Harris. He spoke especially loud so that the guards in the room and everyone else could overhear. Instead of responding to the barb, however, Harris walked over to the table, sat down, and stared at Ian. His eyes were like shiny brown orbs glistening in the fluorescent light. For some reason, Harris's eyes reminded Wilson of the eyes of a snake, cold, aloof, and reptilian. Malcolm Harris's face reflected no emotion. It was as if his features were carved from solid stone. Ian Wilson knew what Harris was up to. He often used this technique in meetings with clients. It was a psychological technique designed to put the other at a mental and emotional disadvantage. Whoever blinks first loses. That is, whoever was the first to collapse from tension was at a disadvantage from that point on. Ian Wilson was a master of the game and could wait out the best, which he did. What could some backwoodsman from the suburbs do to an expert and experienced man like him? Nothing. Harris was so still, not a single movement, that Ian wondered if the man sitting across from him was even breathing. A moment later, during a mental pause, Wilson felt it. The anger, the icy, unemotional calm, even the icy stare that seemed to reach out and take hold of his soul. Why the hell have you come? Did the death of your whore tell you nothing? Come on, you cuckold, speak. Only the resounding silence that followed Wilson's tirade answered him. A moment more, and Ian had to fill the silence. Say something, you bastard. Why did you come here? Did you want to see a better man? Is that it? And Harris still remained a motionless statue. Then Wilson began to berate him, calling him names, accusing him of spinelessness and other humiliating things. Finishing his tirade, pleased with himself, he looked at the guards to see their reaction. Figuring they would react in some way, he was unpleasantly surprised to see both guards staring straight ahead, their faces as expressionless as Harris. 2 more statues. Deaf statues. For a few more minutes, during which Wilson ranted and Harris sat there, oblivious to any action on the guard's part, Ian felt like he was in the Twilight Zone. "Guard, I want to go back to my cell," shouted Wilson to the guard standing behind him. Wilson waited a few seconds, but nothing happened. The guard didn't move. The door did not open. "Guards, get me out of here," shouted Wilson, finding himself almost hysterical. "I want my cell." Still nothing. Ian was about to shout profanities at the 2 guards when suddenly he heard, "Why?" The question was asked in a ringing voice, a voice devoid of any human emotion. It was as if the question was being asked by a computer. Ian turned his head and met Harris's gaze. "What did you say?" Malcolm sat with outwardly smooth aplomb, though inside, deep inside, He could feel the snake of vengeance coiling and unfurling. It was ready to strike, to take this piece of filth and choke the life out of it. To see the light disappear from his eyes, to see his pitiful face go blank, to see death settle in. Instead, Malcolm waited. He knew Wilson had heard the question. Why? Why does your whore belong to me? Why are your bastards actually my children? Wilson asked with a chuckle. Yes. Wilson raised an eyebrow. You're not going to argue with me about terminology? There was surprise in his voice. No. Ian laughed. It wasn't a very pleasant laugh. How nice of you. A glorious wimp. When Malcolm didn't answer anything, Wilson decided to lay out the whole truth and nothing but the truth for him. It would help finish what Ian had started so long ago. I'll tell you. You see, I was a young man then and was just starting my sophomore year at Ridgemont University. I got there because of a soccer scholarship. It worked out for me. I went to college, played what I loved, was single and free. Are you still with me, asshole? Ian looked into Malcolm's eyes and saw nothing but his own reflection there. But he was listening. Good. One warm summer afternoon, a friend and I were walking through some park near the school, and suddenly we saw a girl running. Naturally, we wanted to get to know her better. We tried to talk to her, but the bitch laughed at us and ran past. I didn't like being laughed at. I still don't. So me and my friend ran after her. We just wanted to have a little fun with her, maybe teach her to be kinder. We were just doing that when you showed up. You grabbed us. Remember, you bastard? Malcolm had almost forgotten about the incident, even though that was how he'd met Jessica. He just never dwelled on that memory. And it had been so long ago. Could that be a possibility? Yes? Well, I'm glad you think so, you bastard, because I could never forget it. You bastard broke my ankle and tore ligaments. It killed my chances of playing soccer. I was even going to go pro. Then they took away my scholarship. I couldn't even go back to school. But, you see, I didn't know any of this. I was in the hospital for weeks in a cast, with pins in my foot and ankle. I waited for the cops to come for me. Every time I opened the door of that damn hospital room, I thought the cops were coming for me. But when they weren't, I figured you didn't report this little incident. I told my family that I hurt myself running. Anyway, when they let me out, my parents told me the news. They held back that little bit about school until I was well enough to come home. My ankle healed, but my leg stayed the same, and I've been walking with a limp ever since. I swore revenge on you and her. I didn't know the girl's name or the name of the boy who saved her, but I persevered. It was easy enough to ask people about the girl who ran around the park. It wasn't until your wedding was announced that I was able to get close to you. I still didn't know it was you. But eventually I got lucky and found out how you and that whore met. And, voila, I had you. And then chance knocked. It was some kind of family reunion. A friend of mine who was related to the Robertsons arranged for me and him to attend. All I wanted was to get what was mine. Something that had been denied to me for so long. And then you showed up. You almost drowned me. So yes, you made it personal. And, well, you know the rest. Malcolm sat back, surprised by what he'd just heard from Ian Wilson. It was so strange. How could someone hold a grudge for so long? Did everything that happened happen because he wanted to entertain Jessica all these years? That guy was crazy. Crazy. He better get this over with before he did something he would regret later. Shaking his head in bewilderment, Malcolm slowly stood up. Ian followed him with a glance as Harris rose from the table. I'm almost done. Then I'll leave you alone with what awaits you there, Malcolm said calmly, pointing in the direction of the main prison. Your story doesn't end there, Wilson, doesn't it? You didn't play soccer, but you've done pretty well for yourself since then. With hard work and grit, you've managed to turn a few dollars and some junk into a successful enterprise. Your net worth is about $30 million. Yes, you are very resourceful and persistent. You are to be commended. Malcolm could see perfectly well that his compliments were inflating the little piece of shit. Then Harris finally broke out into a toothy grin, though the expression was more suited to a piranha. Well, Ian Wilson, I'm glad you've done so well for yourself because I'm going to take every last crumb from you. Uh-huh, me. And then I'm going to distribute it to a few charities. Imagine, all that hard work. A man's life's work. It's gone. Poof. Just like that. But the best part, at least for you, is you won't have to die to leave money to charity. In an instant, inarticulate rage filled Ian, and he began to scream. You bastard! You ain't getting shit. You can't touch him. My lawyers will fight you to the end. Oh, I didn't say it would be easy. I'm sure it won't be. But I'll win. In the end, Malcolm said with the same old smile on his face. The smile disappeared and Malcolm's face returned to a neutral expression, though his eyes were even harder than before. You tried to destroy Jackson, and you almost succeeded. Truth be told, if you don't manage to avoid the death penalty and somehow get parole before you die in prison, rest assured, once you pass through those prison gates, you won't be able to take your first breath of freedom before you die. Malcolm said it calmly, but Ian knew Harris meant every word he said. Ian Wilson, being who he was, wasn't going to show Harris his fear. Instead, he stared at Malcolm, and if his eyes had been daggers, Malcolm would have been stabbed 1,000 times. One last thing, Malcolm said. Here, this is for you. He pulled out a sealed envelope and tossed it on the table. A little bedtime reading. Malcolm turned and went to the door, which the guard had already opened, and stepped inside, leaving Ian alone with the other guard. Ian turned to the guard and asked him, Sir, may I open the envelope? He felt hatred for the place he was in, for those who were telling him what he could and couldn't do, and ultimately for the humiliation of asking permission to read the contents of the envelope. The guard looked at Ian like he was a piece of shit stuck to his shoe. Yes, you have 5 minutes, and then I'm taking you back to your cell. Slowly he reached for the empty envelope, and with some difficulty, thanks to his restrained wrists, managed to open it without damaging it too much. At first, Ian didn't realize what he was reading, but then, with extreme clarity, it hit him. He let out a low groan that grew louder and louder. No. Come back, you bastard. It's a lie. Lies. He felt his head being grabbed and pushed against the table with force. Calm down. If you don't calm down, you'll get a good taser shot, the guard promised. You can hear me. Yes. Yes. I can hear you. Ian gasped, trying to calm himself down. But as he lay there, face pressed against the cold metal, something died in Ian Wilson. He could feel it rapidly receding until it was gone from his life. In the place of his will, only emptiness remained. Where his life had once been, only a smoking hole remained. Even the feeling of hope seemed elusive. Another guard appeared and helped free Ian from his shackles. As he was led out of the room, he stumbled, like an old man or a broken man. The guard who had been in the room during Malcolm's visit picked up the envelope and papers left on the table. He quickly looked through them. Hey, wait a minute. These are yours. It's the results of the DNA test. Don't you need this? The guard asked. Ian looked grimly at the guard and answered in a weak voice drenched in defeat. No, I don't want it. Aren't you the father? That's the thing. I'm not the father, Ian whispered, not a shred of life in his voice as the metal door closed behind him with a final clang of metal. The end. If you haven't watched the first part of this video, the link will be in the description. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.